So welcome to the New Waterways Water Speaker Series. The series is brought to you by New Waterways, which is West Australia's capacity building program for delivering better urban water management outcomes across the state. New Waterways would like to thank its partners, the Departments of Water and Planning, WALGA, Department of Parks and Wildlife and the Urban Development Institute of Australia. New Waterways also has a partnership agreement with the CRC for water sensitive cities to help deliver the outcomes of the CRC research program. And so we're fortunate today that Tracy Schultz, who's a PhD candidate from the University of Queensland, is with us. She has a couple of functions in the state over yesterday and today, and it's very fortunate that she's available to talk to us today. So we're talking about engaging communities in water sensitive cities, getting the message right. The transition to a water-sensitive city will require changes to a community's attitudes and water-related behaviours. To achieve this, water practitioners and government agencies will need to effectively engage their communities. As part of the CRC program, the aim of this particular project, Engaging Communities with Water-Sensitive Cities, is to provide information and guidelines on how to get the messaging right. The presentation will highlight the key outcomes of the project. To date, the project has benchmarked water literacy across Australia, identifying key gaps in water-related knowledge, as well as key groups within the population that would benefit from targeted educational campaigns. The project's identified a list of common community-friendly terminology and visuals that help convey key messages relating to sustainable urban water management. The results of literature review establishing best practice recommendations for community engagement will also be presented. Importantly, the presentation will provide details of where you can find out more information. A little bit of background on Tracy. Before starting at University of Queensland, Tracy worked as an environmental policy officer with the Queensland Government and as a research officer with the Queensland Centre for Mothers and Babies. In those roles, she realised the value of engaging the wider public with policy initiatives, which led her to research at the University of Queensland in environmental and social psychology. Tracy is interested in environmental psychology and community engagement. She is keen to work with industry groups and government agencies to evaluate and improve their communications in relation to the images they use to illustrate and accompany public messages. The talk will go for about 45 minutes. If there's anything you want clarified, raise it during the talk, but for any larger, more fulsome questions, if you wouldn't mind keeping those to the end, and we hope to have 15 minutes or so at the end for questions. So with that introduction, I'll introduce Tracy and ask her to address us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So I'm here to talk to you about the outputs from Project A2.3 and how they can help you with getting the messages right. I'm thinking of this as kind of a highlight reel to give you a brief insight into what's contained in each of the reports that we've generated in the hope that it might motivate and encourage you to go and access those reports online. Now, Project A2.3 is just one part of the CRC for water sensitive cities. If you aren't familiar with the CRC, it's a collaboration between industry, government and universities across Australia and a couple of partners overseas. Now, to me, this paragraph nicely summarises what the CRC is all about. So we exist to demonstrate how water can make the dream of sustainable, productive, resilient and livable cities a reality. We have started with real questions and worked with government and industry to develop answers, and together we have built solutions and tools and created enduring partnerships along the way. It makes me feel very warm and fuzzy that I might belong to something like that. Now, specifically, Project A2.3 aims to identify effective community engagement strategies that will promote knowledge about water management, build trust in water institutions, and leverage support for policies that promote sustainable urban water management. So, well, who are we? The project is headed up by Dr. Kelly Fielding, who works with me in the University of Queensland. She works alongside Fiona Martin, Fiona Newton, who is a senior lecturer at Monash University, as well as Angela Dean, who works with us at UQ, and of course there's me. Now, much of the work that I'm presenting here today was conducted by these amazing researchers, so I want to thank and acknowledge them up front. But what have we actually done? What are the outputs from the project that can help you with getting your messages right? Well, one of the first things that we've done is provide a list of best practices recommendations for community engagement. Now, the full recommendations are outlined in this report, but in terms of helping you with getting the message right, the report really lists 3 guiding principles. Now, the first is to know your audience. The effectiveness of your messages rests on your understanding of who you are targeting. And to help you with this, we have developed a report that describes 5 community profiles of engagement. So those groups vary in terms of their engagement, right from the disengaged through to the highly engaged. The report describes some of the demographics, household characteristics of those groups, but as well it offers suggestions in terms of how you might approach each of those different groups. Now, 2 other reports summarise the results of a national survey of Australia's water literacy and attitudes. So the aim of this survey was to assess what our communities know, what they value, and what their water-related behaviours are. Today I'm going to talk to you about the major findings from those 3 reports. Now, the second guiding principle is to frame the message carefully. So this is about making the message relevant to your audience. It's about using clear language and avoiding the use of jargon or poorly understood terms. It's about the visuals. We all know that a picture tells 1,000 words, but you need to be really sure that you're telling the right story. It's also about framing the messages to align with your community's particular values. So today I'm going to present the results of some research that speaks to each of these 3 areas. The last of the guiding principles is to use diverse mechanisms. Now, I'm going to provide a very brief overview of some of the existing communication channels that we might use, but I'm hoping to give you some ideas for some new mechanisms in the hope that they might enable you to target some of those more hard to reach groups. So in terms of getting back to that first principle, knowing your audience. So we often might think that we know our audience. We might even have some of their key demographics, their age, their gender, their income brackets. But the question that I want to pose to you today is, do you really know your audience? So our research suggests that it's much more important that you know what they know, that you know what they value, you know what their attitudes and needs are. If you understand these things, you're much better placed to identify the best way to attract their attention and to maximise exposure. So to help you along on that journey to knowing your audience, we surveyed nearly 6,000 Australian residents to assess their knowledge, their attitudes and their water-related behaviours. Now, from this data, we use something called a cluster analysis to identify community profiles of engagement. So we identified 5 groups that range from the disengaged, who have very low levels of water-related knowledge and very low support for sustainable water initiatives, through to the highly engaged, who have very high levels of water literacy and are already those people who are undertaking sustainable water behaviours. Now, we can describe each of these groups in terms of their demographics. For example, we know that the disengaged tend to be young men, they tend to be renters, and they tend to have poorer community participation. In terms of the highly engaged, we know that they tend to be older women, they tend to be homeowners, and they tend to have higher rates of life satisfaction. Now, perhaps more importantly, we've also identified implications for practice. So for example, with the disengaged, it's much more important to focus on those sort of everyday behaviours, like having shorter showers or washing your car on the grass. For this group, it's really important to focus on the personal benefits of a water-sensitive city, so looking more towards things like access to recreational areas or the economic benefits. You also need to recognise that before this group can fully participate in any engagement campaign, you might have to focus on a bit of capacity building first, as this group often represents people from a disadvantaged background. Now, with regard to the highly engaged, these are your early adopters, and and they are your most likely target for new technologies or new behaviours. So this then allows for the social diffusion of behaviours through informal social networks. It's about social norms. They're highly motivating for this group. I kind of think about social norms as sort of a little bit keeping up with the Joneses, a little bit monkey see, monkey do. Now, it's important to recognise that even though this is our most engaged group, there is still some way to go in terms of support for water-sensitive initiatives. So, for example, only 50% of people indicated that they were willing to install a rain garden on their property. Okay, so another Project A2.3 project that you can use to better know your audiences is the water literacy reports. Now, this data is drawn from the same survey as the community profiles, but this time we're benchmarking Australians' water literacy. Now, to do this, we ask them questions like this. Water conservation actions by householders can significantly reduce the amount of water used in urban areas. Now, I'm sure all of us have answered A, and in which case you answered the same as about 75% people who participated in the survey. But we also ask people questions like this. Which of the following best represents your understanding of what a catchment is? Now, we all know the answer is B, but only about 50% of people answered this question correctly. Now, this next question had the lowest proportion of correct answers. So we asked people, is domestic wastewater and stormwater carried through different pipes? We can see that only 30% of people managed to answer this question correctly. So you will see in the report a summary of areas of knowledge that where the majority of people have knowledge. So for example, we can see that actions in the home can affect waterway health. We know that most people know that soil erosion can impair waterway health. But we also know that most people do not know that stormwater is not treated before entering the waterways. Now, we hope that you use this data to target areas where knowledge is particularly poor, but also to leverage off areas where knowledge is particularly high. To help you target your messaging even further, we also provide this data broken down according to education level, where we can see that higher rates of education are associated with higher levels of water literacy, and also by household characteristics. So we know, for example, that homeowners tend to have higher rates of water literacy. We can also see which states have the lowest or highest rates of water literacy. Now, the survey indicated that Western Australia had the second lowest proportion of people that we would consider as having high water literacy. Now, rather than a barrier, I would hope that you would see this as an opportunity to get out into your community and maybe refocus your efforts on educational type campaigns. Now, while this level of detail is already available in the report, we can also pull the data at the town level. So this is some data that I've pulled for the town of Perth, the city of Perth, and you can see here that in comparison to the national average, more people from Perth understand that garden fertilisers can degrade waterway health, but that less people know what catchment provides their household water. Now, at this point, you might be tempted to start thinking, yeah, but does water-related knowledge really matter? Well, we have evidence to suggest that it does, that greater water literacy is also indicative of greater support for alternative water sources, greater support for rain gardens, higher uptake of water-saving devices, greater use of everyday water-saving strategies, and greater engagement in pollution reduction behaviours. So while I'm saying that knowledge is necessary, you would also be correct if you thought that knowledge is not sufficient for engagement. For instance, we know that how we frame messages is also important for engagement. Now, one of the factors that influences framing is the language that we use. So we created a list of technical terms commonly used in the water space and asked people, how well do you understand this term? So unlike the water knowledge survey, this survey was a measure of people's subjective understanding of the term. We simply asked them, how well do you understand this term on a scale from not at all through to very well? Now, sometimes just that feeling of being comfortable with the term is more important than whether they actually understand the meaning of it. Now, you can see here that some words were understood or perceived to be understood better than others. The more green the bar is, the more comfortable people were with the term. So more than 50% of people indicated that they understood the term recycled water well or very well. But less than 20% of people indicated that they understood the term water sensitive. And less than 10% of people understand the term riparian. Now, with Project A2.3 being made up a bunch of social scientists, we're highly sceptical. So we also wanted to empirically assess whether does jargon actually influence the effectiveness of messages. So we ran an experiment. So we presented the same information to 400 residents across Australia, but we just varied the content slightly. In one condition we used technical language. In another we used more consumer-friendly terms, and in another condition we used the consumer-friendly terms plus the images. And then in our control condition we had no information. We then assessed their support for water-sensitive design initiatives. Now, what we can see here in that the conditions where people received information, support was lowest amongst those who received the technical information. So this is the red bar. In fact, it was barely better and not significantly different from the group that received no information at all. Now, policy support was highest in the green bar, which is those participants that received the consumer-friendly version of the images. I'm just going to give you a little bit. The analysis is still underway, but we've also found that support is lowest amongst those who actually indicated that they are strong environmental supporters. So that's quite contrary to what you would expect. So the technical information condition performed worse for those people who indicated that they are highly engaged in pro-environmental initiatives. It was like they sort of knew that we were using jargon and they were punishing it for us. So that was a really unexpected and interesting finding. Now, so back to our first question, does using jargon influence the effectiveness of messages? It seems yes. Now, am I saying that you can never use technical terms? Not exactly. What I'm saying is that jargon is best avoided in brief communications like bill inserts or your headings. Now, sometimes it's just unavoidable, and in those cases you need to be sure that you explain concepts and don't make assumptions about what people do and don't understand. Now, hopefully you can use our report as a bit of a guide to check those assumptions. But what are some examples of consumer-friendly terminology? Well, we asked people. So instead of words like biofiltration, people indicated that they preferred natural filtration. Instead of the urban heat island effect, this is my favourite, people indicated that they preferred hot city. And instead of a water-sensitive city, people indicated that they preferred words like water-friendly city. I'm going off script now again, but I love telling this anecdote, and it is an anecdote. We ran some focus groups across Australia, and after speaking to them for about an hour and a half about managing stormwater in cities and towns, we would also then say, what do you think about this idea about water-sensitive urban design? And people would do things like, not really sure what it's about, but is it something to do with allergies? Or they'd say, is it something to do with flooding? That the city is sensitive to water and therefore prone to flooding. So it's not an intuitive response to understand that water sensitive necessarily indicates more sustainable. I'm not saying not to use the term, it's just that sometimes it needs a little bit more explaining than we've possibly given in the past. Okay, so now we can also assess whether aligning to different values affects the effectiveness of information or messages. Now, for this survey, we surveyed residents of Brisbane, and we provide information about stormwater pollution, its impact on Moreton Bay catchment, and also what we can do in terms of mitigating those impacts. But we either frame the message in terms of the environmental benefits of improved stormwater management, or we frame the message to highlight the social benefits. And then again, we used a control group who received no information, and we assessed their motivation to change their behaviours. Now, what you can see here is that for those people with a strong sense of environmental identity, so this is looking at the green bar to your right, it is indeed better to frame the message in terms of the environmental benefits. But for those people without a sense of a strong environmental identity, so looking at the yellow bar to the left, it's actually better to frame the message in terms of the social benefits. So how do we do that? Well, in terms of aligning to social values, it's about thinking about your initiative in terms of access to blue and green space or access to recreational areas. For people with a strong sense of environmental identity, it's about appealing to their sense of concern for animals and catchment health. Now, I hope with these last two slides you can start to see the value of using different images to appeal to people with different motivations. And this is where my research comes in. So, do visuals change the effectiveness of messages? Well, the first thing I needed to do was work out what makes an image engaging. The literature seems to suggest that images need to evoke an emotional connection. So, good or bad, sometimes the trick is just to get people to feel something. It also needs to be understood as relevant to the topic. Now, otherwise it serves as a distraction and it actually undermines the recipient's ability to cognitively process the message. It also needs to be personally relevant. Now, this is the most important factor for determining whether someone will or will not pay attention to your message. Now, this is important because images are the first thing that people will look at when receiving a message, be it in a mail-out, be it on the computer screen, be it on their phone. So images can create a connection before a word has even been read. So we know what makes an image engaging, but now I needed to find out what are the types of images that are used within this space. So the next thing I did was look at the websites, Facebook pages, policy documents of 9 different organisations across Australia that provide information about managing water in cities to the wider community. And I amassed a collection of over 450 images, including things like traditional stormwater infrastructure, flooding, new initiatives like green walls, artificial wetlands and rain gardens, as well as the receiving bodies of water like oceans and creeks and the animals that inhabit them, as well as more just pictures of water in urban spaces. Now, I then whittled that collection down to 70 images that I felt best represented that broader concourse, and I took those images to the community and I asked them to sort and rank the images according to those 3 dimensions. So, did it elicit a positive or a negative emotional connection? Did they understand the relevance of the image to the topic of, in this case the focus was managing stormwater in cities and towns, and whether they felt that the image was personally relevant. Now, I obviously can't take you through the results of all 70 images as much as I'd like to, but what I can share with you is some of the more interesting findings. Now, firstly, we received a very neutral response to the images in terms of water-sensitive urban design. So while you and I might find images of rain gardens and wetlands as highly engaging, most people, they didn't have a negative reaction to them, but it's just that they thought that they were kind of nice. Now, in terms of personal relevance, in terms of topic relevance, people did not understand the purpose of any of these infrastructure in terms of mitigating the impacts of stormwater pollution. They generally just thought that the relevance was that the rainwater kept the plants alive. Now, similarly, people had a very neutral reaction in terms of personal relevance. Not irrelevant, but not highly relevant either. What we did find, and this was a consistent finding across all the images, that the more familiar the garden, the wetland was, the higher it was ranked in terms of personal relevance. So if they thought it looked like a garden that was at their favourite park or at a city park, it got placed towards the top of the scale. Now, pictures of oceans were ranked the highest in terms of eliciting a positive emotional reaction and personal relevance. People love looking at pictures of beaches and coral and turtles, but when we asked them to consider the relevance to managing stormwater, the majority of people, so at a rate of 2 to 1, placed these images at the bottom of the scale. They just didn't get it. And they said things like, these are images are out in the ocean rather than stormwater, not relevant. But this was probably the most surprising finding from the study. Now, across all the images, it was really rare to find an image that encapsulated what I'm starting to call the triple threat. So this is an image that elicited a positive emotional connection, was understood as relevant to the topic, and was found to be highly personally relevant. Now, this picture is an example of an exception. So it's what people identified as either Clean Up Australia Day or cleaning up after a flood. Now, I want to stress at this point that my research is conducted with the residents of Brisbane, which in 2011 experienced a major flood event, and just more recently now with tropical cyclone Debbie. So whilst promising, I can't guarantee that this result will generalise to Perth. At the opposite end of the scale, it was rare to find images that sat at the bottom of the scale. So I like to show people this image just as a bit of fun. Can anyone see why people had such a negative reaction to this image? It's incomplete, right? Some people would have a very strong and visible reaction to this image. They would slam it down on the desk and say, I can't even look at it. So I guess there's a lesson in there. Now, the point that I want to make with these two images is that highly familiar, so remember that I tested this with Brisbane community members, that highly familiar or images with people in them received a bump in terms of both positive emotion and personal relevance. Now, I particularly want to stress that images with people in them always sat above the midway point of the scale for personal relevance. Now, I tried all sorts of permutations, and that was the only category of images that I had that finding. So it seems as long as people can identify with the person in the image, it's going to boost the personal relevance of it. Now, the last group of images I want to talk to you about are those of traditional stormwater. Now, in particular, I want to talk to you about the type of emotion elicited by these images. People most often reported feeling disgust. This is despite the fact that they often recognise the value of the infrastructure in terms of managing stormwater. Now, I said earlier that good or bad, the trick is just to get people to feel something. Now, this is because we know that emotions are really important for attitude formation. In fact, some people believe that emotions are more important than our cognitions, what we know for attitude formation. Now, we also know that some emotions have an approach motivation, like happiness or sadness. But we also know that some emotions have an avoidance mechanism, like fear and disgust. So as part of my PhD, I'm trying to assess whether images that elicit different emotions, that have different approach or avoidance motivations, change the effectiveness of messages. Now, this is important because in the water communication space, we're often showing images of degraded waterways and pollution, images that elicit disgust. We're often showing images that elicit sadness. Think about the iconic image of the turtle with the plastic around its neck. So in one of my studies, we presented people with information about how we can manage stormwater in cities and towns. In one condition, there was no image. In another image, we included an image known to elicit sadness, and another we showed an image known to elicit disgust. We then assessed how deeply people process the written information. Did they pay attention to the message? Did they deeply engage? Because we know how deeply people process a message has important implication in terms of how much they learn, in terms of how enduring their attitude shift is, and whether the message is actually likely to bring about behaviour change. So what we found is that yes, overall, people with a low sense of environmental identity paid less attention to the message contents, but that among the 3 different conditions, the message with the disgusting image performed the worst. So this is looking at the blue bar. Worse still than the condition with no image. So this image is a detriment to getting the message across. However, amongst people with a strong sense of identity, the disgust image performed the best. So I guess the take-home message is that we just need to be really careful when using images that elicit disgust. So while it might be motivating for you and I, for those people that sit more on the disengaged scale, people will pay less attention to your message and they'll be demotivated.